All right, welcome back to Overengineered, the podcast where we ask the question, what's the absolute best way to do things we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for? Today, I am here with Len Woodward, and we're going to be talking a little bit about ReactPHP, which is one of those interesting bits of technology that I have played with and always think, there's got to be a great way to use this. But I've yet to find it. It's my hammer, and I'm looking for a nail. And we were chatting about this a little bit.
Same thing.
But before we get into ReactPHP, Len, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself and say hi?
Yeah, my name's Len. I've gone online by the handle Project Gopher for like the last 15 or 20 years. That was like a one-man freelance dev agency, but recently I partnered up with my buddy Ed Grosvenor, and we're trying to set up our own thing called Artisan Build. And so we're trying to just build some cool shit, have some fun. And ReactPHP was one of those things that I kind of landed on by accident because I was trying to solve some weird problems in Laravel prompts for a proof of concept we were working on. And I just learned pretty quick how deep that rabbit hole goes.
Yeah. I think I've talked about this on the show a little bit, but I have a sort of experimental alternative to Laravel Dusk that I call Dawn that is built on top of ReactPHP, and that's my one experience with it. But I feel like in that case, excuse me, I feel like I was starting to get a feel for what it could do, but I don't feel like I unlocked the sort of true power of it, and it just kind of left me wanting more. What was it that first got you? What was this, or can you talk about this sort of problem that you were trying to solve?
Oh yeah, none of this is
for?
like industry secrets or whatever. It wasn't even client work. It was, well, I guess technically client work. So the way Ed and I are trying to structure our thing is we're not doing client work with our agency. We're doing technical co-founders as a service. So we bring on someone who's knowledgeable in a field or has a following in that field. They'll partner with us for like the marketing, the mailing list, and all of that. And then Ed and I get to solve the hard problems. And so for this specific product, we didn't want to build the UI first and get all distracted with that. We wanted to build the product, solve the problem, and then let the UI happen. Because we didn't want to be bound to a design. So we're building everything in the command line as commands. And the limitation that I ran into was that waiting for terminal input is a blocking operation, the way it's implemented in prompts. So when you're looking at like terminal.read or terminal arrow read, it just sits there waiting for the next thing to enter the buffer. And then it'll execute its render loop, and it'll go through that whole process. So what I needed to do was I needed to extract that looping mechanism so that we could do other stuff while we're waiting for keyboard input.
Interesting.
So I spoke about this with Joe Tenenbaum a little bit, and he mentioned he's tried to solve this issue a couple of times, but he hadn't really landed on a solution that he properly liked. And so I looked around at some of the stuff that he did, and his last approach, I don't know if I haven't spoken to him about this since I did this, so I don't know if he knows this, but his final approach was approaching his own implementation of ReactPHP because he took a tick-based event approach. So I don't know if he realizes how close he was to cracking this, but yeah, I was able to just extract that looping mechanism, make a few changes, and that means that we can do we can trigger renders anywhere in the lifecycle. So we can use closure-based callbacks, and inside that closure, then we can call the render method.
Okay. And is that happening so that's just happening on an event loop. That's not using like the async await fiber stuff, right?
Right. I mean, I'm pretty sure that it uses fibers under the hood, and then with those fibers, it uses like a scheduling mechanism. So it uses those features, but it abstracts it all away, so we don't have to worry about it, which is great because fibers breaks my brain.
yeah, it's one of those things where at first it felt relatively straightforward when I was looking at the Fibers API. Like, oh, okay, I think I can wrap my head around this. But then the moment I started to actually think about all of the sort of implementation consequences, I just walked away.
Yeah, that's kind of how I fell into it too, because I was watching a PHP UK talk on YouTube about fibers, and they're talking about concurrency and all of that. And I think I didn't realize in my brain the difference between concurrency and parallelism.
Mm,
So, so we were going through that. I'm like, holy shit, fibers will let me actually run things at the same time. I was looking at that, but it's more like concurrency is just you do this block and then you do this block, then you do the next one. It's not two blocks at the same time. So
hmm.
then you dig in a little bit deeper and it says, yeah, like you can use fibers to switch between these different tasks, but you still need to schedule them and they need to be done in a non blocking asynchronous way. So I was trying to look at how to do that and then found another PHP UK talk by, I think his name is Christian Luck. And
Okay.
that was like the proper final light bulb moment for me with React PHP. It's like, amazing the type of stuff that this allows you to do. And then they give you all these different packages with different implementations of like the browser or the terminal or anything where it's read and written in a non-blocking way.
Right. Have you looked into at all how to implement sort of a library level code that is sort of React PHP compatible, that's async compatible? Because that's something that I don't really understand at all. You know, I understand the principles that, you know, for IO, for example, there's a lot of time just waiting for the file system. So you might as well just relinquish control back
We've got leaf
and
blowers outside, so I'm going to switch to my headphones.
yeah, no problem.
Can you ask like the last half of that question again so I know when it's
Yeah,
switched
yeah,
over?
yeah. Have you looked into implementing any of the sort of any userland library code that is not necessarily explicitly for React PHP, but is just sort of React PHP compatible? Because that's something that I'm not quite sure I have my head wrapped around.
Yeah, so I haven't done it yet, but there's one thing that we're having to do that I think is going to be React PHP compatible. I just don't quote me on it because I haven't tested it. So one of the products we're working on is in the AI space where we're just like assigning different instances of ChatGPT, certain personas with different traits and everything. But we want to be able to easily switch between providers. So it's not always going to be OpenAI. It's not always
Sure.
going to be in the Llama family or whatever. So we're using a service called Open Router, and that allows us to route these requests to all sorts of different services. It supports streaming responses the same way that OpenAI does, but the OpenAI package that we've got, the one that Nuno and I think, oh shit, who is it that wrote it with him? Was it Ruslan?
I'm not sure. I've never used it.
Like, well, so the issue with that is that when you're using a streamed response, um, when the response comes in, it still waits for the entire buffer to fill, and then it acts
Hmm.
after that buffer is filled. So even if you're getting a streamed response, you can't act on it until after the whole thing has come back.
Right.
So using the React PHP browser, I was able to interact with the streamed response just natively using their browser, no OpenAI package. So we just passed our token, our headers, all the stuff. And then as each chunk comes in, then I operate on those chunks. And in the terminal, what I was able to do, because I'm not blocking the output, I was able to trigger a render with the new response as I'm doing that. So the
Mm.
interesting thing is that if this works, I'm pretty sure the OpenAI package lets you inject your own browser instance, which is like a Guzzle compatible or PSR type browser
Hmm.
implementation. So if I can inject this React PHP browser in there, and then I've got the callbacks that'll allow me to act on the chunks instead of waiting for the end, I think this is going to work. So that
Oh,
would be a
that's
really
interesting.
interesting implementation of userland code using this type of thing, kind of like from the outside in. So I don't know if it's going to work, but if it does, I'm going to be super excited because that means I don't have to implement the whole OpenAI API spec again.
Right. And are you using? I know that there's a couple of implementations of sort of like stream compatible JSON parsing where it does hold a buffer until it gets to sort of a token that it can pause at. Are you looking at anything like that where you're you're sort of like partial buffering the responses so that you get some sort of parsable data back, or are you just sort of passing that data back on to wherever the original request came from?
Yeah, I'm pretty much just concatenating it onto the variable and then re-rendering the whole variable. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really
Okay.
having to process anything because we're just getting text input. We're not getting code back, so I'm not having to parse any JSON. And the events that come back are all encapsulated in a little JSON object. So we
Mm-hmm.
just so we parse the event that comes back, and in the event we've got a data attribute, and in the data attribute is just that one little token. And so I'm taking
Mm-hmm.
that token, putting it onto the response, and then rendering.
Hmm. Yeah, that's very cool. It definitely, I've seen that Guzzle has async stuff, has had
Mm-hmm.
async calls for a while. Um, and I know I've had to use it in just um, few very specific scenarios, but it was never something that I really got my head wrapped around other than understanding enough of the API to make, if I needed to make sort of 10 calls at the same time and didn't want to be blocking each one. But,
Mm-hmm.
I know on the HTTP side and on the IO side, there are huge opportunities to write this async style code because, a lot of the time, most of what's happening is just waiting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Waiting for a response, waiting for the data to be received by the other server, whatever it is. So that's a huge opportunity to speed things up.
Yeah, I'd love to dig deeper into this and like understand how these async things actually work, like how promises work as a mechanism under the hood. Because I
Mm-hmm.
understand how to use them and everything, but I feel like there's a gap in my knowledge there where I would love to know. I would love to lift the curtain and just see what it is that's happening. Because whenever you get to that point and you see what it's doing, it's almost always so much simpler than you expect it to be. You expect it to be
Yes.
this like magical black box, and then you look at it and you're like, "Oh my god,
Oh.
yeah, this makes sense. Of course, that's how it would work." So I'm eager to get that moment, but I
Mm-hmm.
haven't had the opportunity yet.
Yeah, especially if the abstractions are like mature and sort of well thought out because they've found those boundaries in ways that make each discrete piece sort of understandable on itself.
Mhm.
Um, so I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about Dawn, this browser testing
Yeah, I've been
experiment.
excited to talk about that because I haven't gotten a chance to go in and properly look at it. So I'm interested to hear about this approach.
Hey, folks, this is Chris from the future. Unfortunately, my video feed froze for a little while here, and we didn't catch it in time. So we kind of started talking, and then realized that we're going to have to end recording and start a new session. So I apologize if any little bit of context got lost in that shift. We tried to pick up the conversation where we left it, and went from there. All right, back to the talk with Len.
So yeah, I did take a look at the code base really briefly for Dawn, but I didn't get a chance to properly go deep into it. So I didn't fully get how it is that you're using the event loop for this because I'm not even fully sure how all the processes interact and what's happening where when you're not doing everything async. So
Yeah. So, uh, part of the problem, or well, let me describe what Dawn does, and then we'll work backwards from there. Um, so essentially, what Dawn does right now is it spawns a couple of background processes that all handle different synchronous parts of that testing story, right? So we've got one background process that manages the Chrome driver. That's the actual tool that's talking to Chrome and telling it to click this button and wait for this JavaScript or whatever you're doing in your actual test. Um, Unfortunately, Chrome driver or the WebDriver implementation uh, in PHP is written synchronously. So once you tell the browser to do something, you're locked until you get the response back from the browser. So I spawn one background process to manage that. I spawn one background process to run a web server. Um, and then we've got our sort of quote unquote foreground process, which is where your test is running. And so uh, in a typical test, you might do a post request to some endpoint, right? So if you were doing this in Dusk, you would tell it to post to an endpoint that would tell the WebDriver to make that request to a separate uh, local web server that's running your application and get the response back. What we're doing instead is overriding the URL generator so that it generates URLs that point to our local test server instead. And that's running a React PHP loop that listens for incoming HTTP requests and then essentially just serializes that request with a unique ID and generates a unique ID and passes those two things along back to the parent process over standard out. And then it waits and listens on standard in for well, no, I guess in the web servers in the case of the web server, it doesn't have to be bidirectional. So it's just essentially forwarding those requests back to the main process. Um,
So you were
and the
saying that the actual interaction with the web driver is blocking,
it's
where you
blocking as
send.
well. Yeah.
Okay, so did you re-implement the web driver so that that one is non-blocking?
No. So what I ended up doing was just spawning a background process for that as well. And so when you make a request, when you tell the browser, say, click this button, it's actually serializing that statement and sending it to a background process to execute,
And so
and
that
then
other
waiting for the
background
response.
process. Yeah, so that other background process is the actual like web request. So are you just then like queuing a bunch of stuff that's getting sent and then it's so you're able to do these things a little bit faster?
Yeah, so there's an event loop in the main thread that's tracking all of this IO between the different processes, right? So it's got standard in, standard out listeners on the messages sent to the WebDriver process and the messages sent back from the WebDriver process. And it's also got an IO channel to the web server process. And so if I make a GET request to the home page, right, that's going to send a serialized payload to the WebDriver telling it to go to the home page. That request is then going to hit my background web server process, which is going to serialize the request and pass it back to the main thread, right? The foreground process. That foreground process is then going to deserialize that request and essentially just pass it to the HTTP kernel as though you had made that request in line in your test. It's going to wait for the
Oh,
response and send a serialized response back to the web server, which will then get sent back to the browser eventually, which will then get sent back to the Chrome driver process eventually. So it's kind of like everything's going through these multiple hops to get anywhere. But because everything is running in these separate processes, even though there's a lot of inefficiencies uh, coming from those multiple hops, you gain a lot of efficiency by, you're most of the time you're just spending waiting on things to either send or receive,
Hmm.
and all the actual work is happening in these background processes.
So the fact that the HTTP request is blocking isn't actually a huge issue. You're putting a layer in between the headless browser and the server, so that everything is being done through a queue, so nothing interferes with each other, and you could do like database operations if you needed to. But then all of your interactions with the browsers, like each headless browser, is its own background process then as well, and you're giving all of your actions to that process through standard in, standard out.
There's just one single WebDriver manager that manages all the browsers. So if you open
Okay.
multiple browser windows, it's just one process that kind of orchestrates all of that.
Okay, but you're still able to then have multiple browser processes that then don't interfere with each other on the request level. So you're sure that everything is not polluting each other, the other test. Am I understanding that right, or am I
Sadly,
still?
no, it's that is just sort of that's kind of a fundamental problem with browser testing is
Mhm.
that if you have multiple windows open, the cookies are going to be persisted across all those windows or tabs or whatever, right? So if
Oh,
I have
interesting.
two browser tests running at the same time, um, they are going to pollute each other. And that was actually one of my first PRs to Dusk was essentially um, changing it so that it cleared all the cookies between each test. Because if you didn't know that and you didn't understand that you had to clear your cookies, you could have session data persist across different tests because the browser was happily holding on to that data,
So the browser instances will each have separate cookies, but but each browser instance that we reuse between tests, those cookies persist.
the browser instances. Well, yeah, if
Like
you're
if you've got
running.
browser one, browser two within the same test, those two have separate cookies, right? So that we can have like
No,
one user
they
logged
have
in
the
here.
same cookies. Yeah.
Oh, so how do we have separate users logged in to test that sort of interaction?
Mm, that's a great question. Maybe there is a way. Maybe there is a way to, um, open multiple like profiles inside of Chromium or inside of whatever browser you're using. Because that's a good point. I None of the tests that I have run have needed to solve that problem, so I haven't had to worry about like the parallel execution on the browser side. I've only had to worry about it on the test side. But that's a
Have
very
you
interesting point.
have you taken a look through the test suite for reverb? Because
I haven't yet. No.
I feel like I feel like he did this in that test suite where he had to have two separate browsers interacting. So he would spin up the reverb server. He would spin up the two browser instances logged in as different users. He would take an action and then check the other browser to make sure that he could see that text on there. I feel like I remember seeing that.
Okay. There must be some way then to do that at the Chrome driver level to spawn a separate browser that is sandboxed in some way,
Hmm.
which
Yeah,
is
I can't
interesting because
imagine there
that
not
opens
being.
up the option to do parallel browser testing, which I hadn't taken on. But yeah, I mean, theoretically, you could have 8 browser windows open running
Hmm.
in parallel different tests. If you can sandbox each browser, I know, and if your machine doesn't start to burn.
Yeah, well, we're all on M chips now. We're all good.
That's right. That's
Uh,
right.
yeah, the only difficulty then that I could see is like the database state between these things, because how does parallel testing work when you're not in a browser? Like, because I know when we're running the test suite, we start a transaction so that we can easily roll it back. But if we're doing parallel testing, Oh, we duplicate the database for each of those. Now I remember. Is that something that we could possibly do within Dusk? So each server instance then would have its own database, so it can do its own transactions. So maybe we've got the one server, but each thread changes the environment variable so that we're accessing a different testing database.
Well, if you're using database transactions, then it's okay. I mean, you're basically like, um,
Can't you only have one transaction open at a time on a database?
no, they should. I don't think so. I mean, it depends. I think that there's some locking concerns depending on what you do, but each test is executing in its own database transaction, so they're already like isolated from each other. Yeah, this is an interesting spot where I have no idea. I have no idea what would happen here. And honestly, it never even occurred to me to consider doing parallel testing with browser testing. So I my whole brain is just like sort of exploding with what are the implications of this? It's really
I don't know.
interesting.
We're not going to get any work done for the next 2 days. We're just going to be hacking on this now.
Well, so going back to sort of the original conversation, what's interesting is I was looking and someone has re-implemented the WebDriver package in React PHP. So they've separated out, and I actually was thinking about trying this myself because I looked. There's really only one single component in the WebDriver package that introduces this blocking issue, and it's like
It's
it's
standard
like the
IO,
HTTP
right?
client. It's like
Oh,
some custom client that they use to make the request to the Chrome driver instance. Because that's all over HTTP. It's just like or over TCP. I don't know if it's HTTP, but it's a client, a network client. Um, and there's nothing stopping you from splitting the request and the response, other than that's the choice that they made, because typically PHP code is blocking, so there's no reason to really think about it async most of the time. So it seemed relatively doable, and it looks like someone's done that. So now that we have a async instance of Chrome driver, right, or of WebDriver, which is the the package that talks to Chrome driver or to Selenium or whatever. We already have a async HTTP server. That's what React PHP does, right? So it feels to me like we could potentially do everything that Dawn is doing, but all inside of one single React PHP event loop without having to spawn any background processes, without having to do any of this crazy standard in, standard out serialization. I don't fully understand like what the boundaries of like memory access and like passing variables around across different fibers in PHP. So I don't know if there's some boundary there that I'm not thinking of that would make this harder. It seems to me like it's doable, and it occurred to me maybe we should like step back. I assume that most people who are listening have at least heard of React PHP and maybe understand the premise of an event loop, but maybe we should like just do a quick refresher just in case.
yeah, for the other 5 listeners.
Yes. Um, so, the principle behind React PHP is this idea of an event loop, which is effectively just a while true with a bunch of things inside of it.
Yeah, pretty much the
It's
same as JavaScript.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. And it's obviously a lot more complicated than that in terms of like there's scheduling and a lot more around interrupting and intercepting the event loop and stuff like that. But it's essentially just a big while loop. And inside your while loop, you have different things that execute, and they have ways of sort of pausing their execution either after a certain amount of time or when a certain thing starts to happen, and then resuming their execution at a subsequent cycle of the loop. Does that feel like a good description of the premise?
Yeah. So as far as I understand, if you give the event loop a blocking operation to do, it's going to kind of mess things up. Like it's going to delay all the stuff. So in our event loop, we've got a queue of things that have to happen, and every time we give it a closure with an action and a listener, it's going to queue those up. If you give it a blocking operation, that's going to take as much time as it has to do in that blocking operation. That's why you're not supposed to pass a closure with a sleep call in there.
Right.
And then yeah, it'll go through, it'll execute things in time. It's got like time trackers, so if you've got stuff that are supposed to happen on a periodic timer, it'll do all those things in order. And because it's in a queue, every time you tell it to do something on the next tick or whatever, you can queue up a whole bunch of tasks there, which is actually how I fake key presses in the testing story for my async prompts. So I just say
Okay.
on next tick. So I take in the array of keys that we're trying to fake, push that onto the event loop on the next tick, which can guarantee order. A lot of these other functions can't.
Mm-hmm.
And then yeah, it just executes them all. So
Interesting.
yeah, what you said is pretty much true. It's just a really fancy while true thing, but it's done in a way where you're not losing events. Things aren't going to just like time out and get ignored.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, with that in mind, basically, the premise of what I'm kind of describing is, um, what we want to be able to do is in our PHP unit test say, this get slash, and have the result of that execution be uh, some response object that's useful to us for testing, right? And we want that to have triggered a browser to make a request to our application and run whatever code is going to happen when you get the homepage. And that a response is going to be the response of that execution. And the reason we can't have that in Dusk is because of this sort of, those are two separate processes that need to happen sort of at the same time problem. But they don't actually have to happen at the same time. They just both have to have a turn, uh, during the same period of time. So kind of what I'm proposing is you wrap the whole test in something that is inside the event loop. Or that doesn't matter so much. There are ways to sort of abstract that away. But essentially, when you do this arrow get, or let's say this browser get, right? That is going to create an HTTP request, or it's going to create a command that gets sent to this WebDriver package that then sends a signal to your browser to go to the homepage, right? When the WebDriver instance sends that signal to Chrome driver, for example, it's then going to yield control of the loop, right? And we'll also have a web server running in the loop that will be ready to receive the request to localhost /, for example, right? And when it receives that request, it's going to probably put it in a queue somewhere, right? And then it's going to yield control of the event loop. Now we're going to have another thing on the event loop that's just looking at that queue and waiting for things to be pushed into it. And when a request gets pushed into the queue, it's going to grab that request. It's going to pass it to the Laravel application that's running inside of our test suite. Essentially, it's going to run the code that this arrow get would run if you just run that inside of your test. It's going to pass that request to the application. It's going to wait for the application to return a response, and then it's going to push that response into a different queue, and it's going to yield control of the event loop. Now we have another thing on the event loop that's looking at the response queue. Are you following so far? I this is complicated, but I feel like I need to get through the whole like chain of events in one go.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm mostly following. I don't think anything ever owns the event loop. So one, we can have multiple event loops. We can do that as well. But everything in the event loop is just event listener based. So really, we're just looking to have these different actions emit an event with all the information that we could need, and then the other whatever it is that we're working with is going to be listening for that event and then do whatever. So if we've got the browser that's got a listening event on execute request, then like we send the request out, and then we send the event out through React PHP instead of like interacting with the browser directly or anything. I feel like it's all making sense. It's always a bit of a mind fuck playing with
Yeah,
React PHP because
it really
one,
is.
as PHP devs, we don't usually do a lot of like async await or event loop based code callbacks and all. I mean, we're using more
Yeah.
callbacks now than we were, but it's a weird way to have to think, especially when you're writing the React PHP code, because you're basically defining all of the behavior and then you're triggering the behavior, which is always odd. I mean, having worked in JavaScript land for as long as I did before my recent PHP clients too, like, I mean, I've been PHP JS together for like the last 15 years or whatever. So I've always been jumping back and forth. I feel like I'm better positioned to be able to work with these callback type things, event listener, event loop, but it's always a bit of a thing with PHP.
Yeah, I think maybe an easier way to kind of put all this in a single mental model is like just imagine four queues, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
one queue that is these are um these are commands going to the browser, right? And there's one queue
Mm-hmm.
that these are responses to commands that went to the browser coming back from the browser. Those are two queues, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's two additional queues. One is these are requests that are going out, and one queue that is these are responses that are coming in, or vice versa, requests that are coming in and responses that are going out. And we
Mm-hmm.
have these like four queues, and we essentially have four processes sitting on the event loop that just sort of take control of the process, that come into the foreground, as it were, check to see if it needs to do anything to pop something onto one of those queues or to pull something off of one of those queues, and then goes back into the background. And then the next process, one of those processes is only dealing with sending out commands to the browser. The next one is only dealing with responses back from the browser. The third one is only dealing with HTTP requests that are coming in from the browser. And the fourth one is only dealing with responses that should be going back out to the browser. And all of that is just happening on a constant loop where each one just says, all right, I'm going to wake up. I'm going to check to see if there's anything I need to do. I'll quickly do it and put any result of that work onto a queue, and then I'll go back to sleep. And then the next one says, all right, now I'm going to wake up, check to see if there's anything I need to do. If so, I'll pull things off of the queue. I'll push things back on the queue, whatever I need to do. And then I go back to sleep. And each one of these just does that constantly in a cycle. And so even though each one of these things would traditionally be a blocking process. Because we've split them up into each individual discrete chunks and are taking control and relinquishing control just for like a brief period of time, we can treat them as though they're all happening at the same time. I mean, maybe that gets back to your point of like the difference between concurrency and parallel processing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's making more sense now. So you've got your four queues, and each of these things that has its queue is checking the on each cycle or each tick of the event loop. Each one of those four queues is looking for stuff to do. If there's something there, it does it, and if it's not, it just lets the other queues check their work, and just we're doing this on every single cycle. So yeah, I feel like there's a way to do this. I don't know I don't know how we would bridge the gap or kind of mimic the whole parallel testing story with like switching databases in real time, because like there's got to be a reason they were doing that. They wouldn't just duplicate these databases, because anytime I run my parallel tests, it takes that database and then it makes 12 different versions of it. So they have
Right.
to be doing that for a reason. So if we were to do something like that with our databases, swap out environment variables on the fly, as we're executing each of these different tasks. So each of these events that's getting dispatched to the event loop would have to know which instance it is that it's doing all this stuff for, so it knows which headless browser to send it back to, and then also which database that it's got to use. So
Which
there'd
would
be
be
some fun
perfectly.
problems to solve.
I actually, now that I think about it, that doesn't seem as hard as it did the first time around, because um, for each parallel process, you'd also spin up a ReactPHP web server, and each one would just be listening on a different port. So you would just basically say, okay, requests that come into port, you know, 8801 are for the process that is connected to your test database one, and requests that come in to port 8802 are associated with the with database two, and so forth. So you could essentially just the parallel story would be kind of the same as it is with the database. It's just we're running multiple instances of this web server listening on different ports.
Well, web servers usually do web servers usually run on multiple threads, like so you can handle properly parallel responses, or do they run on a queue so you're handling concurrent responses or requests? Because I feel like we'd probably
Uh,
still only need the one server instance, because
well,
everything would
just
just
the
be in
way
a
that
queue.
React PHP works, I think it would make more sense to have, um, because each of those is going to be in a different memory footprint. So it makes it a lot simpler to just have one,
Mhm.
sort of one event loop per parallel process.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, like we said, React lets you have multiple event loops now. I don't know how they all interact when you've got multiple loops. I've only ever done work where everything is done on the main loop. So that way you're just doing like loop colon colon get, and you're just getting the one instance on the main one. But if we did have everything on its own event loop, I wonder what that would look like, and if it would be harder to manage or easier to manage.
I don't even think it's possible to do it the other way, because when you do paratest, you're spinning up, 4, 8, 12, however many threads of separate processes. So each one of those is going to have its own event loop. They're not going to be talking to each other at all.
Okay.
So
Oh, so
you
that's
would
probably
still.
why they were doing the multiple databases, not because of multiple transactions. It's because they're on separate processes.
Right. I mean, yeah, that I actually still don't know. I still don't know the answer to, because even though they're on multiple processes, like you can have 12 separate connections to the same database, like,
Right.
but yeah, it must be that the block, like some of the blocking that comes up when you have multiple transactions open, you know, becomes a bottleneck. I'm not
Hmm.
sure. But
Man,
the
computers are
reality is
hard.
we don't have to solve that problem. It's already solved by someone else, right?
Yeah. Oh man, I think this would be a lot of fun to play around with. I've got too many other projects. I don't have time.
Yeah.
I still haven't even been able to finish a proper integration with Composer for Conductor, because all my Conductor stuff is being done through the process facade, and I'm trying to use Composer
Hmm.
as a dependency now, and you do all of that. So I got other fun problems to solve. But man, this has my brain going 1,000 miles an hour. I want to be able to do more
It's
stuff with React. It's too fun.
it is a very cool. I mean, the other thing that I've played with recently that got me thinking about React PHP is just I finally um built one of these SSH connected um PHP prompt scripts, like Joe has been
Oh, one of
doing.
Joe's TUIs?
Yeah, and essentially that's on an infinite while loop. Um and so a particular implementation decision meant that I'm actually executing a new prompt like for each cycle of the interaction, right? So you'll essentially like be prompted to do something, and then that prompt will exit inside of while loop, and then a new prompt will get run.
Like a same
Um,
instance of the same prompt, just with different.
no, a new
Uh,
instance of the same prompt. It's like it's stateless. It every time it just starts anew. Um, because it's essentially mimicking a shell. It's this fun thing. If you anyone hasn't seen this, just do ssh endless dot directory, and you will get um, a shell that has basic commands like cd and pwd and ls, and you can cat files. Um, and all it is you can essentially cd into any directory you can imagine, and then cat any file that you can imagine would be in that directory, and it will give you that file back using OpenAI.
hmm.
Um, but I didn't want to have to think about like scroll back and all of that stuff. So I just thought, okay, when I type like PWD, I want the prompt to handle all the keyboard input and all that stuff. But once I print out the working directory, that prompt just ends, and now a fresh prompt starts. Um, and that way, as you interact with the shell, um, your history is just handled by your terminal. We don't have to deal with history.
Hmm.
Um, and it made me think like this would make sense to be inside of an event loop rather than just a while statement. And there might be some interesting opportunities, especially around like um, those um, HTTP requests to OpenAI take a little while. So like when you are um, opening a file that no one has ever opened before, I have to make that request. I can't just use the cache. Um, and it would be nice if that wasn't totally blocking. Like you could do that and we could render, even if it was just like an animated loading indicator or something like that. And I know that that can be done with process control a little bit. Like that's how the spinner process works in
Yeah, I
prompts.
I tried to re-implement the spinner in this new async prompt of mine. I didn't exactly finish it,
Interesting.
but like the way they all the stuff they had to do to get that to work just feels so gross. Like props to them for making it work, but holy shit. It
It is
it's
that
not.
is mind bending. The process control forking, where it's just like you have to like decide what to do based on what process ID you're in.
Yeah, and I mean it makes sense because you can't necessarily do that in an async way because you don't know whether or not the function that it's running is blocking or not. So you can't be triggering a re-render on this. So, I mean, there might be a way to do it better where we just fork the process once, and then we're doing that process on a loop to re-render the thing, and just a little bit more clean.
Mm-hmm.
I might pick that up again, but yeah, the other thing like streamed output and stuff like that, instead of spinning up another prompt instance, that's one of the things that I did in the prompts with my async prompt implementation. So we can trigger a render at any point. You pass a callback into it, and as you get the output from the other thing, then you're triggering a new render. And
Mm-hmm.
also let me do other things as well, where I've got a debouncer built in. So now I've got like a Scout powered search endpoint. And instead of sending out a search request on every key press, it debounces for like 300 milliseconds. And we don't
Mm-hmm.
really have a way to do that in prompts the way it's built right now.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's interesting.
I I submitted. I've had like 5 PRs go into prompts to try to get these projects of mine moving forward, and I had like this one final PR that was like my last compatibility PR, where I take the looping mechanism and I extract it into a separate protected function so that we can
Okay.
extend that and overwrite it. The only thing is, technically, I think it could be a breaking change because when we're setting the output for the terminal, I changed it to static output instead of self output. And I haven't had the opportunity to check this to make sure to see whether or not it actually is a breaking change or not. So they ended up closing the PR. I'm gonna buy Taylor a beer in Dallas and see if we can reopen that, because with this final PR, it allows me to have this really, really minimal implementation on a new abstract class that extends the original prompt. And I just overwrite a couple of methods and then put my React PHP looping mechanism in there and then overwrite the testing trait. And
Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah, so if we
That's
could
actually
get that
really
final thing in there.
interesting. Yeah, to think about, now that there is React PHP, and there are other asynchronous PHP libraries out there that use a similar principle. Um I'm blanking out on the name of the other one. It's got like a
Are you
lightning
thinking
bolt
about the
logo.
PHP extensions like that
No,
React is built
no.
to be able to use, like libev?
No, there was a project that came out right when fibers first came out that was essentially um trying to be a really low level abstraction above fibers, still low level but a little bit higher level than fibers. Um and it implemented its own event loop, I'm pretty sure, but I'm blanking out on the name of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um I'll add it to the show notes if I can find it. But it would be interesting in prompts to essentially be able to say, use this event loop implementation, right? The default prompts
Mm-hmm.
event loop implementation is just a while loop. But like, you could make that fully extensible without it really costing a whole lot, right? You just
Yeah.
extract the code that runs inside of the loop into a separate callable, right? And
Yeah, that's
then,
literally all I did with this. Is
yeah, that's really clever.
so because I had to change that call to from self dollar output to static dollar output. I think that's why they closed it, because I mean they're working on a whole bunch of crazy new shit that they're going to announce. So they're all heads down. They don't have time to evaluate this and make sure that it's not going to break anything. So I understand why they closed it. But yeah, that's all I did. I took out the while loop, put that into a new function, so that I could then overwrite the output, because I can still use buffered output in tests, but I've got my async output, which just uses the React PHP streamable writable interface. And then
Mm-hmm.
I've got the streamable readable interface. So I can do all of those things asynchronously. And then yeah, we overwrite a couple of those things. One of the funniest parts of that PR though, it feels so dumb that I had to do this. And it's nothing to do with the way they wrote it or the way that I wrote my thing. It's just the nature of prompts, because even though in prompts, you don't really have any prompts that are capable of returning null, but null is a valid return type. And in some of my prompts, like I had a video a while ago where I did a tabbed scrollable select. So it gives you some
Mm-hmm.
tabs where you can scroll back and forth. It automatically scrolls and then all of that stuff. You can select your thing and it gives you the value. However, in my implementation, you can hit escape and it'll return null. And the way that I was using it was if you return null, then you hit a go to statement and it goes back to give you new options and you go through the same thing again. So null
Mm.
is a valid return type. So in their loop, like if it knows to keep on looping given a certain um, given certain results or whatever. But once we extract that looping mechanism, if we return null, whereas it would normally just continue the while loop, the function, like the whole loop has already executed. So what I had to do is if you return if the function returns without the looped thing having returned null, it returns an instance of a class called nothing. So I've got prompt slash support slash nothing. And in that render method, it says if this arrow run loop equal is instance of nothing, then run loop again or whatever.
Mm.
This is just
Yeah,
is
that's funny.
really funny that I had to do this. It felt really dumb, but the solution looks really clean if you look at it and the way it gets
Mm-hmm.
used. So it's
Hmm.
kind of like in Go or whatever when you're checking for nil or whatever.
Yeah.
Like so it's yeah. There were some problems I had to solve. I think I did okay, but it's not
Yeah,
it's not just
it's a
Archer
tough
levels
one.
of code beauty.
Prompts is wild. I mean,
Mhm.
I've only looked at it a little bit and just when I was pairing with Joe, so he kind of knew what he was talking about and could steer me away from making all the terrible mistakes that I was about to make. Um, but it is, I mean, it's such an impressive tool and it's such a straightforward. I mean, essentially, prompts is an event loop and a state machine, right? And a renderer. Like
Mhm.
that's what it is just you've got an event loop that executes some thing that updates the state of your state machine, and then a renderer that renders based on the current state of your machine. Um,
I really
and
think
that
it's an
abstraction
interesting
is
rendering paradigm too. It's like the difference between Vue.js and React.js because every single loop of the render function, you're blowing up your whole terminal output and you're re-rendering the whole thing from scratch. You're not going in and targeting certain areas. So it's an interesting paradigm, and that was really fun to see and experiment
well, it's
with.
interesting. I talked with Jess. I think we talked about this on the podcast. She originally implemented it with like a diffing algorithm,
Mm.
but found that doing full re-renders was faster and like reduced or was as fast and didn't have any of the bugs that they had to deal with the diffing algorithm. So
Yeah, it makes sense.
originally it was trying to just change the areas that had changed, but it just turns out that that didn't really matter, which is funny.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe on a super old computer, it would have made a difference. I'm not sure if the
Yeah, maybe on my
processor
parents'
speed.
386.
Ugh. All right. This isn't React PHP, but you brought Conductor up, and I did want to
Mm.
just like talk about it briefly because I think it's such a lovely idea. Um, and I know I talked about it on the podcast before. I know that folks have talked about this on Twitter. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a composer version of NPX, right? Something where you can
Mhm.
just execute a composer package binary without actually having to have that um, installed into your project or globally installed. And those are the types of things where this is something that you're only going to have to do once to create a new project, and you might never need to run this command again, or it's like, with Tailwind, they have a npx command to set up a new Tailwind project. It's like, you don't need to have this running on your machine. It's just to get you some stuff into your apps directory.
Mhm.
But having the same thing for Composer would be so cool, and would open up a lot of possibilities. And so you've been working on Conductor, which is a tool to do exactly that.
Yeah, it's fun. I found a couple of fun use cases. So, like, for a project where maybe you want to try PHP stand, but you haven't, you can always just like run it and see if it passes at level 5, or you can try running it at level 9. You can see what files would get changed if you do a dry run. I've done the same thing for some rectors. One really useful use case is JMax Laravel Shift CLI. So he's got some of these automated shifts where like you can run this thing through Conductor and then you can remove all the doc blocks from your code. Or you can run certain things where like, oh, I think this one's a rector instead, where if you're just doing a one line function returning it, it'll change it to a short function. Um, so you've got all these different little things where you don't need to have this thing installed in your project. And you don't need to have it installed globally because it's run so infrequently that the next time you go to run it, it's probably going to be out of date. And so the proof of concept that I whipped up, it's really, really simple. Like I'm just using the process facade. The thing's built on Laravel 0, so you get all of those affordances. So I just use the process facade, run everything in TTY mode. So if there's some sort of interactivity that you need, you can do whatever you need to in it, and it's not going to block and hang. Um, and then that got a bunch of conversations going. Like it got pretty popular for a tweet for someone with as small a following as mine. But Roman got in touch with me from the PHP Foundation because he's trying to build a tool called PHP Up. He had a talk at PHP UK recently where he was talking about comparing the PHP ecosystem to all these different programming ecosystems. So you've
Mm-hmm.
got like Go, which has a really tightly integrated ecosystem. Everything like the static analyzer, everything is built in. And then
Yeah, even
stuff
the
like
like
Rust.
formatting.
Yeah, yeah, and then the same with Rust, and Rust has Rust Up. So he's trying to develop PHP Up or FUP. But he was trying to do this thing where he packages up the PHP binary and then he ships it so that you don't need to install anything, just everything comes with it. And he was bundling Composer in with that, but he wanted to be able to run a bunch of these Composer packages. Do not disturb mode has been turned on. Now the freelancer chat's going nuts. But he wanted to be able to run all these different tools like PHP stand and rector and all of that, but he didn't want to have to be bundling all these different things. So he was one of the people that wanted a tool like Conductor as well. And so he got in touch with me. We chatted a little bit and he sent me an elephant.
Very cool. I like it. It's a black and pink elephant for anyone who's listening.
Yeah, it's got troll's hair and it's pretty dope. Fits in with my other elephants nicely. But yeah,
Love it.
Roman is just a super fucking clever guy, and we chatted for a while. We were just talking about different RFCs, why certain ones might have gotten closed and not gotten passed. We talked about the history of PHP. We just chatted and nerded out for a bit. We looked at his project. We talked about what Conductor might look like and how to get it set up so that we could bundle it. And so instead of taking the process approach, what I'm going to take instead is use Composer as a dependency and try to use all these different commands within there. So I'm not executing any of the binaries myself. I was already deferring to Composer or yeah, Composer exec package name or Composer global
Mm-hmm.
exec package name, which has the drawback of flags, like passing flags is just pure violence. So if you're trying to run SOM, you have to do like conductor run Vimeo slash SOM dash dash space dash dash dry run because every set of dashes is going down to the next process. So if I was calling the binary directly, I would only need two sets of dashes. But because I'm going to composer exec, that's another set of dashes. So So I'm going to try to just use these commands directly, which has the added benefit of it's going to make it easier for Roman to bundle up into PHP up because you're not using the process facade, you're using the code. The
Hmm.
other benefit is that I could then take this system of mine and I could PR it to Composer and it wouldn't be a
Right.
breaking change. So instead of them having Composer exec, we could have Composer run, and then we
Yeah.
could have all of this same functionality. We don't have to wait until version 3 then. This could ship as soon as I'm done. And so Ed's got relationships with some of the people that are deep into the Composer contributors. And so we're going to see if this is even something that they'd be open to having. But if they're not, we can always just have it be like a plugin or extension or a separate binary that ships. So we got a
Hmm.
lot of different abilities there. But again, the the composer code base is pretty broad as well. So I'm trying
Yeah.
to go through that and figure out exactly how I'm tying into this, how it's calling all these different things. So I don't have a whole lot of time to work on it just because of all the other shit I got going on, but I'm really excited for what this could look like in the end. Like I haven't even properly announced composer or conductor. I've just teased it, and like people are already using it. it's got
That's
it's
awesome.
got stars on GitHub, and like I've never actually linked anyone to it. So they're just finding it.
That's wild. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
so that
pretty
was kind of
cool.
funny.
Is this the first composer plugin that you've written?
I haven't started doing it as a plugin yet. I'm just trying to
Okay.
make the code work, and then I'll probably try to take the plugin route afterwards. I don't
Hmm.
know if doing it as a plugin is going to be the right move or trying to PR it directly to Composer. So
I
we'll
think
see which route it
generally they'll
takes.
be the same, mostly the same implementation though, because you're going to be
Mm-hmm.
working with the same APIs, whether it's coming from inside of Composer or inside of a plugin. I don't think makes a huge difference,
Mm-hmm.
as far as I know. Yeah, I had. This is a thing I've been meaning to pick this up again because I think when Composer 2 came out, it broke it and I didn't use it enough to really care. But I had a Composer plugin that I wrote that all it did was it kept track of what Composer commands you've run on different branches of a project. Because, and I'm curious if this has ever happened to you, because I'm not sure if this is a widespread problem. But in my case, if I'm working on a branch that lives for a little while, where I've installed some different dependency or changed a version of a dependency or something like that, every single time that I pull in changes from production or um, it just introduces a bunch of merge conflicts because of the composer lock file. Um,
Mm-hmm.
where the only change is really that I did composer install whatever or composer update one particular package. And so I always thought it'd be nice to just be able to, inside of a branch, just run something that's like, just replay the the composer commands that have run on this branch since the last time. And that way I can just revert the composer.lock file and essentially reinstall whatever I installed fresh without having to deal with merge conflicts or rebasing or anything like that. Um, and it was kind of interesting to build, to just to play with the composer APIs and the plugin ecosystem, because I don't see much of that. But there are interesting things there. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I've definitely run into that issue. Usually, I'm usually like a merge in, merge out kind of guy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll usually just nuke the composer.lock and then just composer update and then commit that. I don't necessarily like doing it that way just because you're doing more in the merge commit than you're actually merging. And I don't always
Mm-hmm.
like doing that. So what I've started doing recently is I'll actually do a proper rebase. So
Mm-hmm.
we get that changed composer.json and composer.lock from main. It gets to the conflict. Then I just look at the packages that I installed, run that again, then run composer update, and that's the new commit. And then we just replay the rest, and it just works out fine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I am having to rerun that proper update command manually.
Right.
So I don't know if a plugin would solve that for me, but I mean, it's not generally a problem that I run into terribly often.
I mean, that's the reason why I never kind of picked it up again. Is it's like it happened. I wanted to sort of experiment with the Composer plugin, so I used that as an excuse. But once it broke, I didn't really have much of a reason to rebuild it because I didn't get enough utility from it.
Hmm.
Oh well, other than our brief hiccup in the middle there, this has been a great chat. Is there anything else that you were hoping to get to? Any other React PHP stuff or anything
No, I
else
think we
on your
touched on
mind
most of
before we
it.
call it?
No, I think we got to all of it. Um, yeah, I'm about to hop on a call in like 2 minutes with Eric Barnes so we can chat about whiskey because
Nice.
I got all these products. I didn't actually realize that Verbs was using whiskey, so I'd be interested in knowing what you do and don't like about that. So that would be another fun chat to have briefly. I
Sure.
don't know
I
if I
mean,
have
it's
time.
just it just works. I don't have to think about it. that's
Is it
that's
easier
what I
for you
like
than
about it.
Husky? That was my goal. Is
Uh
it better than Husky?
yeah, I mean, it works. I feel like I ran into issues with I don't think we were using Husky before. I think we were using like some other thing called like Composer Git hooks or something like that. But it had a bunch of incompatibility issues,
Mm.
and so I switched to Whiskey because that felt like the best option at the time. But um, it's one of those great tools where you don't have to think about it. you know.
I've tried to build it that way. Yeah. Like the biggest thing that I did is because recently I changed a major architectural thing. Here, I'm just going to send a quick message to Eric saying that I got to push this back like 3 minutes. Be there in 5. Just finishing up another pod with Chris. So yeah, I changed something architecturally recently where I had to do this really nasty thing where inside of the Git hook, I was registering a call to a shell script, and then the shell script would call my Laravel 0 app to get a list of the hooks that should run,
Mm.
but it could also skip the hooks if you needed to based on like an environment thing. You know, if you do dash dash no verify. But there's some actions that don't support that. So you can just do like whiskey skip once, and then you can like finish a merge and go dash dash continue, and it's not going to
Oh,
run the hook.
interesting. Oh, that's cool.
Um, so I was doing that. The reason I had to do this was just so that we could get the proper terminal output, but colors weren't being maintained. It was just really ugly.
Mm.
Um, so instead, now we're just calling whiskey directly, and we're doing everything through the process facade using TTY mode. So you
Oh,
maintain
interesting.
interactivity, you maintain terminal colors, but in order to do that, that means that the command that's saved in your Git hook changes. So if you update the version of Whiskey, that thing isn't going to exist anymore. So when you install Whiskey, Whiskey update will run. Like it still has that command, but it just routes that to Whiskey update, updates the new Git hook so that it uses a new system, then calls the new system, and then it all just kind of works. So I've done this thing specifically so that when you change something within Whiskey, it'll update itself in a seamless way.
Yeah,
So
that's awesome.
hopefully that works for everyone.
Yeah, I mean it's been solid for us for sure.
I'm going to be
Well, I
repeating
know you got
all
to
of this in
go.
like the next 20 minutes.
Is there is there anything that you would like to specifically call out, promote, hype, and also where do people find you on the internet?
Yeah. So my project Gopher, like at Project Gopher, is pretty much my handle everywhere. Project is spelled with a K instead of a C. So find me on GitHub, sponsor me. You can find me on YouTube now under at Artisan Build, because that's the technical co-founders as a service agency that Ed and I are starting. Yep. Twitter is at Project Gopher. Pinkery is at Project Gopher. LinkedIn at Project Gopher. Find me on all the places. Find me customers, find me clients, find me work, give me sponsorships, Give me stars on GitHub. That's the one that I really want. I just want the warm and fuzzies from knowing people use my work.
We don't care about money. We care about stars.
Yeah, we just want credibility.
For sure. Well, this has been really fun. Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.